Hello, my name is John Wing. I'm an associate professor of history at the College of Staten Island at the City University of New York. And this is my talk. It's titled War Making, State Building, and Environment Forming in Spain during the reign of Felipe II, 1556 to 1598. I'm a specialist in the history of early modern Spain and its empire from about 1450 to 1800. My research interests concern the rise of Spanish imperialism and how this related to changes in the stewardship and exploitation of natural features, such as forests for shipbuilding in both Iberian and colonial contexts. In the 16th century, 1500s in particular, the early modern Spanish state was forming quickly as a body of interrelated entities under the authority of the king, designed to channel information to the center, manage finances, collect revenue, and mobilize resources to pursue royal goals. Understanding the goals of Spain's dynastic politics and the mechanisms by which they were pursued reveals that major changes in the making and delivery of nature occurred, which in turn enhanced state power. Pre-modern states were created in part to make territory and the biosphere accessible, legible, knowable, and utilizable. So I'm broadly drawn to environmental history, political ecology, geopower, and many other themes of the World-Ecology research network. This talk is taken from an article I'm working on for a special issue of a journal focused on early modern empires and the environment. In this article, I examine 4 examples of what we might call environment making or environment forming in the context of an expanding state power propelled by the demands of war and empire. The cases I examine are Mercury mining at Almaden, Spain, forest management along Spain's north coast, river navigation, and horse breeding, particularly related to the stables in Cordoba, which was the image you saw before was Cordoba and the Guadalquivir River. First is the case of mercury mining and refining, which really has a lot to do with silver. The production of silver was the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire, and from the beginning of Felipe II's reign, was greatly dependent on the supply of mercury. This was because of what we call the amalgamation process, or patio process, of refining silver. In the Americas, access to high-grade silver ore had become limited by the mid-16th century, which slowed production of silver and brought about a genuine crisis for the Spanish crown. The crown's appetite for silver meant that when a techno-chemical process of refining lower grade ore was introduced to the silver mines of New Spain in 1554, the method was rapidly adopted and soon spread to Peru as well by 1572. Fortunately for the Habsburg king, even miraculously, as some contemporaries posited, 3 of the world's largest mercury deposits were located in Habsburg lands. Almaden, Spain, would wind up supplying mercury to New Spain. Huancavelica, Peru, would supply Potosi, modern-day Bolivia, and Idria in Slovenia would supplement demand when production at the other 2 dropped. The mercury amalgamation process boosted production of silver, and Spain's empire became as dependent on mercury as on the precious metal at a ratio of 1.29 to 1. In one published calculation, 116,000 tons of mercury was used to produce 90,000 tons of silver in the early modern era. And nearly half of this came from the mines of Almaden, Spain. Almaden's mine, located near Ciudad Real in the heart of La Mancha, had been in operation since Roman times, but was used mostly to produce vermilion, a pigment used as a dye derived from a sulfide ore called cinnabar. Cinnabar is also the most common source ore for refining mercury. So Felipe II diverted and escalated production at the mine to serve the rapidly rising demand for mercury to operate the amalgamation process in Mexican silver production. The crown sought to increase production over time, placing strains on the available local resources, beginning a process that would link the small town to the circuits of a global empire. The king did this by negotiating contracts with the owners and operators of the mine, the Fugger banking family. The Fuggers had long served as the bankers and debt holders of Habsburg monarchs, including Felipe II's father, Emperor Charles V. Each contract between the crown and the Fuggers increased the amount of mercury that was to be produced and delivered to Seville, and hammered out agreements over the use of local resources and allotment of laborers, typically from the royal prison of Toledo. In 1593, the Council of Orders sent an inspector named Mateo Aleman, who went on to write a famous picaresque novel. Some think is based on his interviews of the people who worked at the mine. Mateo Aleman went to record and assess conditions at the mine. During his visit, Aleman uncovered terrible abuses against the workers and reported on the effects of inhaling mercury dust. The rising demand for more mercury led to the increase in the number of forced workers who faced a great risk to their health. It also led directly to expanding the tunnels, the consumption of fuel wood, conflicts with local herdsmen, and also created a massive and specialized transportation network for the liquid metal. The rising amounts of silver exiting America and the increased harassment of treasure ships in the Atlantic and the Caribbean by Spain's enemies brought with it the need to build more well-armed vessels to defend the sea lanes. In times of healthy shipping and shipbuilding, the crown could requisition merchant marine vessels for warfare when it needed to. But a crisis in northern Spain set in from the 1550s. Felipe II took an active interest then in finding remedies for the struggling shipping centers. He grew concerned over the state of the northern forests and wanted to ensure that the northern shipyards had access to enough adequate timber. In 1574, Felipe II appointed Cristobal de Barros, the first superintendent of forests and plantations. He was in charge of conserving forests for naval shipbuilding. Spain's wars and imperial defense needs brought direct crown oversight to forests near the major shipbuilding sites for the first time. The collection of geographic information and actionable intelligence proved key to the operation of state power in northern forests. The king relied principally on reports from Cristobal de Barros in regions that were well known to have trees suitable for shipbuilding, and also collected information on the array of local forestry laws in the region. The king also took interest in finding new supplies of timber outside the heartland of Basque, Cantabrian, and Catalan shipbuilding, especially during the months following the Armada failure against England in 1588. So you can see in these images in the top right, that's just the finished product, so to speak, of all of this. And if you start in the forests in the bottom left, these are the regions of northern Spain, Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, the Basque country. And the lower right, you see, that blue cutout is kind of what the forest administrators were looking for, especially shaped timbers that can then be used to construct something like the galleon you see there in the other image in the top right. There were extensive reconnaissance missions, which outside of the northern forest regions, which aimed to inspect forest conditions for suitable timber, as well as the economic viability of supplying wood to shipbuilding centers to expand the process. Reports such as these provided the Crown with a cost-benefit analysis of timber access, including information on where the best timber sources were, who was there to manage them, and how road building and river navigation would be required for transporting the timber to the coast. In the forests, the Crown depended on municipalities to plant and care for the trees for years before they could be used for the Navy. What Barros and later superintendents did was direct and restrict the actions of people in forests near the sea or navigable river. People required licenses for felling trees and were required to plant certain numbers of specific species annually. The superintendent was often viewed as an outsider who did not have the best interests of the municipality at heart. Barros appeared to be quite aware of this, and he opted to take a soft approach to the municipalities. Barros's successors, however, took harsher approaches, which led to standoffs, disobedience, and other forms of resistance. In the long run, though, the work of the superintendents paid dividends for the Crown, as many reforestation efforts worked well, especially in the Basque Country. By and large, the roots of Spain's empire were made of water. Spain's transoceanic connections were well known, but its interior waterways played important roles as well. The Iberian Peninsula is not particularly blessed with navigable rivers, however. Some of the major rivers, though, were partially navigable or were made navigable through the difficult work of rock removal, canal building, and the construction of sluices and gates. When navigable, rivers provided a cost-effective mode of transporting timber and other bulky goods down from the mountains. Rivers were used to run mills and irrigate fields and groves. They powered commerce, shaped settlement, and animated the movement of goods. By the middle of the 16th century, the crown gained a greater interest in the navigability of strategic waterways for its own purposes. Initially, this interest was in supplying timber for naval shipbuilding, palace building, and other royal construction. Felipe II made Madrid his capital in 1561, which brought royal construction as well as massive population growth to the region. He also built and refurbished royal properties at Aranjuez and El Escorial. Much of this construction required timber from the Serranía de Cuenca, the region of the source of the Tajo River. So here's the source of the Tajo River around here, is the Serranía de Cuenca, and flows past Madrid. Jarama River passes the Manzanares, and Jarama River flows into the Tajo, which you can see flows almost all the way across the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula. And at the mouth of the Tajo is the city of Lisbon. The Spanish crown absorbed Portugal in 1580, and Felipe II sought ways to facilitate the integration of the kingdoms, renewing an old interest in making the Tajo navigable. While the king was in Lisbon in 1581, he approved a proposal from one Bautista Antonelli, an Italian military engineer, to survey the river up to Toledo to assess its navigability. The project would extend to Madrid, and Antonelli optimistically envisioned making the other major rivers of Spain navigable as well. As the challenges of Felipe II's reign mounted higher, including the fighting of wars on multiple fronts, improving the mobility of goods and people through his kingdoms became an urgent priority. The technical challenges of making the Tajo navigable and the economic challenges of raising enough money were surmountable problems, but the political challenge posed by people and institutions against the project ultimately led to its failure. Objections came from Seville, whose port would lose out on a lot of the carrying trade. Toledo, as a city, retained a more immediate outlook focused on the impacts of river use near the city, including the fact that the current of the Tajo would increase and damage mills. They were not persuaded by the grandiose plans of Antonelli and the king. While a stated aim of the project was to improve communications with the Portuguese, many Portuguese also did not want to pay for what they viewed to be their annexation by Castile, and voiced opposition to the project. Ultimately, the clash of opinions along the river prevented the full-scale implementation of Antonelli's plans after his death. Something that might seem quite limited in scope, like the navigation of the Tajo, turns out to reveal its connections to much broader and more diverse concerns, the full extent of which has not yet received dedicated historical attention. Regarding another way in which the king pursued his vision in order to improve the public good as he defined it, was through increasing the numbers and quality of Spanish horses. For the king, horses possessed a dual set of values, those that would be useful for war and those that would be appropriate for the culture of noble and royal horsemanship. As wars both proliferated and escalated in the early years of his reign, the king responded to concerns that high-quality horses were scarce in Spain. In 1562, Felipe II took steps towards remedying these problems. First, he issued a decree setting out a number of measures to combat the scarcity, declaring that he would pursue simultaneous efforts to increase the number of horses and improve the breed. Second, the Cámara de Castilla distributed questionnaires to horse breeders throughout Spain in order to learn about the state of the practice in the king's realms. The results of these surveys contributed to the establishment of the king's new program of horse breeding at the Caballeritas Reales de Córdoba, or the Royal Stables of Córdoba. There were other royal stables in Naples, Madrid, and Aranjuez, but this one would be different. It was established to breed a certain kind of horse, what would become the caballo andaluz, and the king supported the project with legal provisions, pastures to provide the best breeding environment, an administrative organization designed to prioritize the animals, as well as sources of financing from the royal treasury. The king looked to the best pastures in the region, in particular those along the Guadalquivir River, including private and public lands. The king had rights to the public lands and could assert control more easily there, but would limit common resource use. Initially, the king relied on the common lands, but from the 1570s, the numbers of mares were rising and the need for more pastures grew. However, the royal estate did not have the funds to buy or even rent outright these private pastures. So the king opted to look for people who were willing to offer their pastures and mares in exchange for offices and titles over lands and municipalities. As with other examples, the crown asserted its primacy in the landscape ahead of local and municipal uses. The crown interpreted the shortage of horses to be a problem of concern for the state and required steps to be taken that would reorient resources, funding, land, and labor to increase the number and quality of horses. And here we have typical dehesa kind of pasture land that you could find where these horses were breeding. And this is an equestrian portrait of Felipe II. There he is, Rubens painting after Felipe II's death. And this is an image today of the royal stables in Cordoba. You can still visit them today. Historiographically, each of these topics have remained separate from each other and separate from the main threads of Spanish environmental history. One reason for this might be because each topic has been dominated by non-historians, including mining and forestry engineers, geographers, economists, veterinarians, and legal scholars. The specialized scholarship has done a lot to further understandings of technical knowledge, but is focused less on how changes relate to the historical dynamics of socio-political culture and state formation. The war mobilization process began by manipulating natural processes, the growth of woodlands, the flow of rivers, the reproduction of animals, in ways that were often at odds with local level methods. What was dramatically new and different in the 16th century, especially during the reign of Felipe II, was the scale at which the state got involved and redirected energies to serve state goals, mainly imperial defense. We can begin to find ways to connect these cases. For example, the crown intervened more directly in each case once it identified a potential problem, real or apparent, that could affect the operation of empire and the carrying out of its priorities. Problems were identified in the declining returns of silver, crisis in shipbuilding, inadequate and costly river transport, and shortage of horses. The crown relied on human and non-human natural resources of Spain to address these problems, but it required the crown to take unprecedented steps to ensure that it could access the right kinds of resources and produce adequate amounts of the right quality. The solutions pursued by the crown did much to centralize geographic knowledge of the realm, to utilize various types of expertise for the implementation of technological change, and to use the full power of the law and threat of force to encourage active participation by the people of Spain. These efforts began around the same time, and especially during the reign of Felipe II, but they would continue and expand under his successors through the 18th century. State building and environmental control worked in tandem. The state relied on the voluntary and forced cooperation of countless numbers of people: farmers, loggers, carters, navigators, prisoners, merchants, and so on, for their labor, their tools, their property, their knowledge. Much more work is needed to appreciate these perspectives. Despite meaningful differences, these subjects indicate an expanding royal power pursuing and prioritizing imperial goals that necessitated a reconfiguration of local practices within specific environments. Making these connections demonstrates the importance of the reforming of the Spanish environment to address the problems of state in an era when state building was shaped profoundly through war and empire. Thank you.